half the active manpower of the United States drifting helplessly in search of work. Marriage is off 22%. Birth rate down sharply. Suicide rate 40% higher.
The crash is the worst America has seen in its short history. And Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation is reduced almost to nothing. Hundreds of millions of dollars are evaporated. The partnership of Goldman Sachs lost $13 million of its investment. Within a year, hundreds of investment trusts go bust, taking down investors and investment banks with them. Goldman Sachs manages to survive the crash, and its clients surprisingly stayed with the firm. All thanks to one man, Sidney Weinberg. Sidney Weinberg is raised in a poor Brooklyn household. He's the third of 11 children. To support the family, he's forced to quit high school early. But even as a young man, Sidney shows a willingness to work hard and the ability to network. Started as a janitor at Goldman Sachs, he hustled his way to the very top of the company in a period of 15 years.
He had a tremendous capacity for connectivity with other people. It was impossible to not like being with Sidney Weinberg.
With his ability to make friends in high places, Weinberg single-handedly brings about the majority of the investment banking business to Goldman Sachs, including taking General Electric public. Even after the collapse of Goldman Sachs Trading Group, Sidney's clients still decide to stay with the firm. The successful comeback of Goldman Sachs makes Sidney Weinberg hungrier than ever. He now attempts to do something impossible. He's going to take Ford Motors public. Ford Motors is a giant car manufacturing company started by a revolutionary entrepreneur, Henry Ford.
Ford always thought in the sense of consumerism, how one could sell a vehicle at its cheapest. You know, sometimes populists in politics talk about a chicken in every pot. Henry Ford wanted a car in every driveway.
By 1956, Ford is the second largest car maker in America. Its IPO will make any investment bank a fortune.
Henry Ford, he never trusted Wall Street. He thought Wall Street was gambling and that it was to rip off the folks.
Even J.P. Morgan Jr. has failed to take Ford public at one point.
Henry Ford was a great man, but not a good man. And, was really a devout anti-Semite. So we can never mistake greatness in business for being a great person.
But it has been 9 years since Henry Ford died. His grandson, Henry Ford II, is a vastly different man. To Sidney Weinberg, this is his chance to cash in.
The big breakthrough came in the 1950s when Goldman was allowed to underwrite the IPO of Ford Motor Company, given that Henry Ford was considered anti-Semitic, sort of a sea change on Wall Street.
As profit rolls in, Goldman Sachs needs to find more ways to reinvest them. As it turns out, a small trading department at Goldman Sachs has been making a killing. This department is led by a legendary trader, Gustav Levy. America is on the rise. After the Civil War, the country experiences rapid growth like never before. One industry reaps the reward of this economic prosperity more than any other: Wall Street. Goldman Sachs, a prominent investment bank, capitalized on the expansion of American businesses by taking them public, and in the process, making itself rich and powerful. After the IPO of GE and Ford Motors, Goldman Sachs becomes one of the most profitable investment banks on Wall Street. But to them, it's never enough.
They don't think in terms of money. They think in terms of winning. Now, naturally, if you win big in business, money follows. But that shouldn't be your objective. Your objective should be to win, to win. win, win all the time. Not sometimes, every time.
While Weinberg brings in a steady stream of investment banking deals, one Goldman Sachs trader has struck gold with a trading strategy called block trading. His name is Gus Levy. Born in a middle-class household in May 1910 in New Orleans, Levy dreamed of making the big bucks in New York. Through calculated risk-taking, by the time Levy turns 30, he's already a millionaire and a well-respected partner at Goldman Sachs. His specialty is block trading, a form of arbitrage. Levy learns that because the market can react unpredictably when the investor sells a large block of shares, he could negotiate a price with the investor privately at a discount. He then will resell the shares gradually in the market at a profit. At that time, there were many inefficiencies in the market that give rise to these arbitrage opportunities. The profit is small, but firms like Goldman Sachs had a high leverage. By the 1960s, as Sidney Weinberg is approaching his retirement, Gus Levy becomes his heir apparent. And for the first time, a trader becomes the boss at Goldman Sachs.
Yes, the guy was a shaker, maker, and doer. Gus, he was in there 7 o'clock in the morning with 2 secretaries working with him around the clock. His life was the business.
For the coming decade, Gus Levy drastically grows the trading business, making it a major source of revenue for the firm. But as Goldman Sachs issues more securities and engages in trading at a larger scale, the firm becomes even more vulnerable. For a lot of finance companies, it doesn't matter how big they get, they're often just one mistake away from a total collapse. Goldman Sachs is about to make that mistake. When the Pennsylvania Railroad acquires New York Central Railroad in 1968, it becomes the country's largest railroad company called Penn Central. While the company already has a $1.2 billion in debt, an enormous amount, it still needs more to operate. It hires Goldman Sachs to issue another $100 million of commercial papers. With a high rating, and especially seeing Goldman Sachs as their underwriter, investors pour in, eager to buy Penn Central's commercial papers, believing they're a safe investment.
The bankruptcy trustees have done their best to give good railroad service. But Penn Central has not been able to generate revenues sufficient to prevent continuing deterioration of its track and equipment, including its freight car fleet.
After the bankruptcy of Penn Central, the investors of its commercial papers are nearly wiped out. And they immediately start suing Goldman Sachs for misrepresentation. The funny thing is that the National Credit Office, a rating agency, give the debt a high rating because Goldman Sachs was its underwriter, and Goldman Sachs pushed the company to issue more debt because of high ratings. In the end, Goldman Sachs is ordered to pay 20 cents on the dollar for the investors of Penn Central's commercial papers. That's interesting, isn't it? It's almost as if Goldman Sachs knew something was going to happen beforehand. But the Penn Central scandal is just a sign of things to come for Goldman Sachs. As the economic conditions worsen in the 1970s, more securities Goldman Sachs issued are going bad. Goldman Sachs is repeatedly forced to pay millions of dollars in settlements to companies like Getty Oil and University Health Foundation. But none of this prepares Goldman Sachs for the tragedy that is about to unfold.